The ominous day of July 11, 2020, was marked by a tragic event in a small house nestled in the picturesque mountains near Los Angeles. Marc Angelucci, a respected 52-year-old lawyer who had achieved significant success in his profession, became the victim of a brutal and senseless attack. He had no idea that an ordinary visit from a courier would have fatal consequences for him. When Marc opened the door, he was confronted by a stranger in a FedEx delivery uniform. The man handed over a package and asked for a signature of receipt. The lawyer, assuming it could be work-related documents, reached for the parcel. However, at that moment, the courier suddenly pulled out a gun and fired several shots at Marc point-blank. The wounded man collapsed on the doorstep, and the assailant instantly vanished from the crime scene, leaving his victim bleeding out. Neighbors, hearing the gunshots, called for an ambulance, but Marc succumbed to his injuries before the medics arrived. Investigators who arrived at the scene of the tragedy were faced with an extremely limited amount of evidence. Apart from the bullets extracted from the victim's body, the killer left almost no traces. Detectives launched an investigation, focusing on examining Marc's associates to determine possible motives for the crime and the presence of recent conflicts in his life. It appeared that robbery was not the attacker's goal, as Marc's personal belongings and valuables remained untouched. The manner of action and the ruthlessness with which the assailant acted indicated that he was driven by a deep animosity towards his victim. The lawyer was shot immediately after opening the door, and then, while lying on the floor, he received control shots to vital organs from the cold-blooded killer. Unfortunately, Marc had virtually no chance of survival. During the investigation, police officers spoke with Casey J., a close friend of the deceased. This woman played a significant role in Marc's life. Although their relationship was purely platonic, they felt a deep affection and respect for each other, like a brother and sister. For Casey, Marc was a reliable support and protector, so his loss became an unbearable pain for her. Their acquaintance took place during the filming of a documentary. Casey was impressed by how much Marc's personality differed from the stereotypical image of a lawyer. He turned out to be an open, cheerful, and witty person who enthusiastically talked about his work. Marc was not chasing money and dedicated a lot of time to providing free legal assistance to those in need. In addition to his primary legal practice, Marc was actively involved in issues of gender inequality concerning men and often provided them with free legal consultations. He strived for fairness and objectivity in court decisions. In his opinion, the strengthening of the feminist movement had led to biased attitudes, where in most conflict situations, the man was automatically considered guilty. Marc argued that the current legislative system did not provide equal opportunities for defending men's rights. Detectives thoroughly studied Marc's biography and personal life. He lived in the cozy town of Cedar Pines, located in the San Bernardino Mountains near Los Angeles, California. Marc's friends and acquaintances refused to believe that he could deserve such a brutal reprisal. The lawyer was a highly qualified specialist, a pleasant and decent person. This insidious attack, which left no chance of survival, resembled a meticulously planned crime. Marc Angelucci was a rather well-known and influential personality. He actively used social networks, regularly shared his professional achievements, published motivational posts, and gave advice. He gave the impression of a respected man, completely devoted to his cause. Marc did not have his own family or children. From a young age, he decided to dedicate himself to his career, which became his main priority and calling. Thanks to his tireless work and complete dedication, he managed to become one of the leading lawyers in the state. Successful professional activities allowed Marc to purchase a spacious house and a luxurious car. He was always neat and elegant, preferring a restrained business style in clothing. During the investigation into the circumstances of Marc's death, police officers drew attention to his active participation in the men's rights movement. As a law student, he joined this movement, inspired by the story of a friend who became a victim of domestic violence in 1997 but could not get proper help. Marc did not seek to sow enmity between the sexes but only wanted to draw society's attention to the fact that men often find themselves in an unequal position during court proceedings. He advocated for equal rights and fair treatment for everyone, regardless of gender. Moreover, Marc provided free legal support to men in matters of child custody during divorces. His activities could be perceived differently in society, so the possibility of involvement of representatives of radical feminist groups in the attack was not excluded. Casey recounted that she and Marc were so close spiritually that he virtually became part of her family. The lawyer always supported his friend in all her endeavors. When Casey got married in 2018, Marc drove for 7 hours to personally congratulate her at the wedding. Since Marc had no close relatives, Casey feared that the investigation into his murder could be delayed due to the lack of persistence on the part of the family. Therefore, she decided to take the initiative into her own hands and began actively seeking to solve the crime and punish the perpetrators. However, her efforts had not yet yielded tangible results, as the police still had no substantial leads. The situation was complicated by the restrictions associated with the lockdown. Despite this, Casey was determined to make every effort to find the killer. She had no doubt that among Marc's closest associates, there were no potential criminals, although she admitted the possibility of a random attack. Casey was convinced that the lawyer's professional activities played a key role in the tragedy. Marc often represented the interests of low-income clients in lawsuits against influential and wealthy opponents. Each of his victories could cause dissatisfaction among the powers that be and become a motive for a brutal reprisal. To identify possible suspects, police officers interviewed numerous people from Marc's circle, but they did not have time to gather solid evidence before another chilling crime occurred. This time, the victim was Judge Esther Salas from New Jersey. The attack, which received extensive media coverage, took place on July 19, 2020. A man dressed in a FedEx courier uniform appeared on the doorstep of the judge's house. When the door was opened by the 20-year-old son of Judge Esther Salas and lawyer Marc Angelucci, student Daniel Anderl, the assailant opened fire. Without hesitating for a second, Dan shielded his father with his body, taking the bullets intended for Marc Angelucci. After the young man fell, the attacker shot Marc 3 times. Both men suffered serious injuries but still showed signs of life when the unknown man hastily fled the crime scene. Marc Angelucci's wife, federal judge Esther Salas, fortunately remained unharmed during this horrific attack, as she was in the basement of the house at that fatal moment. However, this does not in any way diminish the tragedy and shocking brutality of this incident. After the shots, the criminal quickly left the scene, leaving the severely wounded father and son to their fate. Initially, reports about Dan Anderl's condition circulating in the media contained rather contradictory information. Some sources reported his death at the scene, while others indicated a critical condition in the hospital and uncertain prognosis. This discrepancy in the data only intensified the stress and despair for the young man's relatives, who were already suffering from severe shock. Of course, they desperately hoped for the second scenario, but because of this confusion, they could not even determine exactly where the injured Dan was currently located. Only later was the worst news confirmed: he had indeed died from his injuries. Despite the considerable distance between these two attacks, their connection became apparent to investigators. The modus operandi, the choice of victims, a lawyer in one case and a judge's family in the other, as well as the probable use of the same weapon, everything pointed to the existence of a well-thought-out and planned malicious intent. It seemed that in the second incident, random people were injured, while the real target was Judge Esther Salas herself, who miraculously avoided the attacker's bullets. FBI agents quickly joined the investigation, combining forces with the local police. The most modern forensic methods and technologies were employed. Ballistic examination confirmed that in both crimes, a .38 caliber pistol was used, which only strengthened the investigators' version about the involvement of the same perpetrator in these attacks. In addition, the victim's neighbors drew attention to a light-colored car that hastily departed from the populated area. This vehicle immediately caught their attention, as it clearly did not belong to any of the local residents. Unfortunately, due to the mask on the attacker's face, no one was able to discern his appearance or distinguishing features. It is worth noting that all these events took place under conditions of strict lockdown, which undoubtedly played into the hands of the criminal. After all, wearing a mask to hide the face in such circumstances looked quite natural and did not arouse excessive suspicion. Since the true motives of the attacker remained unknown, law enforcement officers began to fear new possible attacks aimed at people associated with the judicial system. Investigators continued to believe that the main target of the second attack was Esther Salas herself, the first Latina to hold the position of federal judge in the state and the mother of the deceased young man. She had a brilliant career, including being nominated for the Senate in 2011. She lived with her husband Marc Angelucci, who initially worked as a prosecutor and then became a lawyer, as well as their son Daniel. Esther went through a difficult path, starting as a public defender and providing free legal assistance to various segments of the population. These efforts brought her success in her career and financial well-being, which allowed her to start a family and achieve high professional and social status. She started from humble beginnings, renting a small apartment and persistently pursuing her education. Esther believed that education would be the key to fulfilling her dreams and aspirations. Indeed, years of tireless work and determination brought her to the top of the legal profession. Daniel grew up in a family of hard-working parents who often worked overtime. Sometimes Esther simultaneously handled dozens of cases, completely devoting herself to work. At the same time, their family was very close-knit and evoked sincere respect from the local community. Danny had been active and athletic since childhood, particularly playing on the school's soccer team from the age of 10, demonstrating significant success. However, after graduating from high school, he decided to focus on his studies and left his sports career behind. Later, in 2018, the young man entered law school, following in the footsteps of his parents. Despite the demanding academic program, the members of the Esther Salas family remained very close and maintained a strong bond even after their son left for college. According to relatives, Daniel grew up to be a decent young man, far from the criminal environment or dubious companies. He was not prone to aggression and had no enemies. There were also no signs of mental disorders or emotional problems in the last period of his life, which made it difficult to understand the motives for the brutal attack on him. Detectives were inclined to think that Dan became an accidental victim in an attack aimed at one of his parents, most likely his mother, the judge. The murder of this cheerful and promising young man became a real shock not only for his family but also for the entire community. The news that the crime was committed by a delivery service courier instantly spread and sowed fear and panic in society. After all, under conditions of isolation and quarantine restrictions, couriers remained almost the only thread connecting people with the outside world. As long as the killer was at large, no one could feel safe. Law enforcement officers were under significant pressure to solve this case as soon as possible. However, the investigation was significantly hampered by anti-epidemic restrictions and security measures. Investigators continued to analyze all available information and evidence, even despite their limitations and fragmentation. According to Daniel's loved ones, on July 17, 2 days before the tragedy, he met with friends and spent a warm family day with his parents. The young man gathered his dearest people to celebrate his 20th birthday. No one had any idea that this would be the last meeting with Dan. He did not complain about any problems, everything seemed cloudless. It was hard to believe that this friendly and non-confrontational guy could have made any mortal enemies. And then, 2 days later, the fatal doorbell rang at the Esther Salas house. The owner, Marc, peered out from the second floor and saw a man in a FedEx courier uniform on the porch with a large package in his hands. He was surprised by a delivery in the middle of a Sunday, as this was extremely rare. Moreover, the family was not expecting anyone and had not ordered anything. The whole situation aroused great suspicion, especially considering the quarantine. While everyone was still trying to understand what was happening, Daniel carelessly approached the door and opened it without even asking who had come. Further events are reconstructed from the words of the father, who became the only eyewitness. The courier addressed the young man with a request to call Judge Esther Salas to sign some documents. While Dan was wondering where his mother might be, Marc began to descend the stairs. At that moment, shots rang out. Probably, it was the appearance of the father that provoked a sharp reaction from the assailant, who immediately opened fire. Daniel instinctively covered his chest with his hands, taking some of the bullets. When Esther, attracted by the noise, came up from the basement. A horrific scene unfolded before her eyes. Her severely wounded husband and son were lying on the floor in pools of blood, and the shooter had already disappeared. She immediately called for an ambulance. The medics urgently took Dan to the hospital, trying to save his life. In the hospital, surgeons temporarily stabilized the young man's condition, and for a while, he remained conscious. This made him a valuable witness for the investigation. Detectives hastened to talk to him right in the ward. Unfortunately, Daniel only managed to catch a glimpse of the attacker, so he could not provide a detailed description of his appearance. Soon after, his condition deteriorated sharply, and despite all the doctor's efforts, he died from his injuries. This was a devastating blow to the entire family and countless caring people who supported them during this terrible time. For the Esther Salas couple, Daniel was their only long-awaited child. Before his birth, Esther suffered 3 painful miscarriages, which became a difficult ordeal for the couple. They had been dreaming of parenthood for years and did not lose hope despite all the setbacks. Therefore, Dan's arrival into the world was perceived as a real miracle and the embodiment of their most cherished hopes. The parents believed that their son had all the potential to change this world for the better and reach incredible heights. But a cruel and senseless tragedy shattered all these plans and hopes in an instant, leaving only the bitter pain of loss and emptiness. While U.S. Special Services investigators and FBI agents continued to search for evidence of the crimes, another tragedy occurred about 200 kilometers away from the second incident. In a remote area near the Beaverkill River near the town of Sullivan, New York, an abandoned car and a man's body were found. Documents in the name of Roy Den Hollander, a 72-year-old lawyer from New York, were found on him. Such crimes rarely occur in these regions with low crime rates, so local residents were deeply shocked. Unlike the previous cases, a gun was found next to the body, indicating a possible suicide. Further investigation confirmed these suspicions. In Roy's car, an envelope with the FedEx logo was found, addressed to Judge Esther Salas. It was similar to the one brought by the courier during the attack on the judge's house. Detectives quickly established a probable connection. Esther had just avoided the fate of a victim. Ballistic examination showed that the .38 caliber pistol found near Roy was the same weapon used to shoot Mark, Daniel, and his father. According to the investigation, Roy could have carried out the attacks on Mark and Judge Salas's family, and then drove to the north of New York State, where he took his own life. However, the question remained open: was it remorse or another mysterious death in a chain of murders of workers in the justice system? The situation was complicated by the fact that the deceased Roy Den Hollander was an experienced lawyer with an impressive professional biography. Continuing to examine the scene, police officers found additional evidence linking Roy to the series of brutal attacks. In his belongings, notes with the addresses of both victims were found. First on the list was Marc Angelucci, second was Esther Salas. It became known that in early July, Roy visited Los Angeles. Immediately upon arrival, he was caught on several surveillance cameras. The man was wearing a mask due to the pandemic, entering cafes and appearing on recordings of other cameras, gradually approaching the house of Marc Angelucci. All the facts pointed to Roy's involvement in both murders, but the motives remained unclear. Delving into the suspect's past, detectives discovered several alarming details. Checking his computer and mobile phone, they found that he had been writing memoirs of almost 2,000 pages for a long time, the content of which caused serious concern. Having studied these records, police officers concluded that they were dealing with a person suffering from deep mental disorders. The book began with a dedication to his mother, "May she burn in hell." Roy felt a pathological hatred for his mother for giving birth to him but not giving him love and care in childhood. He blamed her for the death of his older brother, who died under mysterious circumstances long before his birth. After his mother's death, Roy scattered her ashes on the lawn in memory of his brother. It all started when Roy Den Hollander spent some time in Moscow, where he once participated in a street fight shown on television. During that period, he was known as a self-confident and eloquent lawyer who worked for a local human rights organization in 1999. Throughout his career, Roy earned an impressive resume and received a good education. However, he had one weakness: women. He led an active nightlife, visiting Moscow clubs and bars, where he sought companions among young girls. In 2000, his attention was drawn to a model whom he fell in love with. Roy married a 24-year-old girl named Angelina Shipolina and moved with her to the USA. She was an attractive model. However, their marriage was filled with contradictions from the very beginning, and soon the couple divorced. Both accused each other of cruel treatment. In his memoirs, Roy openly demonstrated misogynistic views. In his diaries, he called his ex-wife a stripper or a commissioned person. He claimed that she used him to move to America, and as soon as she received a green card, she immediately left him. After a painful divorce, Roy Den Hollander became filled with hatred towards women and began actively defending men's rights. He initiated a number of lawsuits aimed at protecting men's interests, including processes against bars, clubs, and other establishments that provided free services to women. Roy even spoke out against his former educational institution, Columbia University, accusing it of sexism. Despite the defeat, he continued to aggressively fight for men's rights. Against this background, the murder of the first victim, Marc, seemed paradoxical. Marc, being an anti-feminist and a lawyer, shared many of Roy's views, although not in such an extreme form. Both advocated for men's rights and, it would seem, should have found common ground. To better understand the motives for the crime, police officers spoke with the murdered man's former colleagues. It turned out that Roy considered Marc a competitor who encroached on his territory in legal practice. They were in a men's rights protection society, from which Roy was later expelled for overly aggressive behavior. The society strived for gender equality, rejecting the ideas of misogyny and discrimination against women, which contradicted Roy's beliefs. After his divorce from his young wife, Roy's personal life came to naught, as did his professional career. He suffered defeat after defeat, declared himself bankrupt. He often fell into alcoholic binges and heard voices, using forbidden substances. Roy had delusions of grandeur, publishing bizarre videos where he senselessly accused those around him. Although many did not take him seriously, the man turned out to be extremely dangerous. Roy's condition was rapidly deteriorating, which colleagues and close acquaintances noticed, but no one sounded the alarm in time. In 2018, on his social media pages, Roy Den Hollander announced that he had been diagnosed with terminal-stage melanoma. He complained about the lack of proper medical care and even filed a lawsuit against the hospital, accusing the doctors of negligence. But the case was dismissed. These publications gave the impression that he was trying to draw attention to his person or justify professional failures. He continued to share his thoughts on the internet in July 2020. Meanwhile, the careers of Marc Angelucci and Esther Salas were developing successfully. They regularly appeared on television and gained recognition in their field. Marc and Esther's colleagues never perceived Roy as a threat. He was not present at conferences on men's rights, did not threaten or enter into conflicts with future victims. No one even suspected that there could be hidden problems regarding him. On the eve of the series of crimes, Roy suffered another professional failure. His appeal was rejected by Judge Esther Salas, and then he was removed from the case when the client changed lawyers. In his diary, he left an enraged entry, accusing the judge of laziness and unprofessionalism. Apparently, this event became the catalyst that pushed him to the decision to act. The killer's first victim was his rival, Marc, which shed light on the motives for the crimes. The next targets were the young and promising Daniel and his father, a lawyer with extensive experience, respectable citizens. Relatives had high hopes for Daniel, believing that he would reach unimaginable heights. But unfortunately, he died at the hands of a man who had lost faith in life. The father suspected that the bullet was intended for him, but his son saved him at the cost of his own life. This selfless act allowed the father to stay alive. He regretted that he did not meet the killer first instead of his son, saying that he would gladly switch places with him. The father himself received 3 severe wounds and recovered in the hospital for a long time. However, fortunately, none of them turned out to be fatal. The man begged the police to find the scoundrel who had taken his son's life. Fortunately, the criminal did not have time to harm anyone else and took his own life with the same weapon with which he had taken the lives of 2 people. No one could understand why Roy ended up in this particular area on the last day of his life, which became his final resting place. The Beaverkill River, a popular spot for trout fishing, where the Rockefeller family estates and other wealthy people are located, seems to have been a special place for Roy. FBI agents found out that as a child, Roy spent summers at a camp nearby. Probably, this place had a special meaning for him. It is quite possible that it was here that he spent the happiest moments of his youth. While studying the man's disturbing notes, investigators came across a list of names of lawyers, well-known doctors, and other specialists. Among the materials found was a photo and information about another judge, Janine De Fiore, who apparently was to become the next victim. After checking the list, detectives found that except for the first 2 victims, none of the named persons suffered from Hollander's actions. Perhaps he was planning attacks but changed his mind, or the deterioration of his health forced him to abandon further plans. It seems that the disease took over and he decided to end his life. However, one important question remained unclear, whether he acted alone or had accomplices. Investigators warned everyone on the list about potential danger if Roy had accomplices. People were worried and demanded protection, waiting for clarification. But detectives needed time to analyze a huge amount of information, including 2,000 pages of memoirs. After thoroughly examining the list of Roy's probable victims, the police were still unable to understand what prompted the lawyer to start hunting people. The list seemed like a random selection of names not connected by obvious logic. In the end, all those mentioned in the list were reassured, as FBI agents concluded that the 72-year-old lawyer was acting alone. Analyzing his records took hundreds of hours. Most of them contained various contradictory statements. However, he did not specify specific motives for persecuting someone from the list. The latest social media posts concerned the pandemic, where he accused the state governor of a large number of victims, claiming that he had not introduced the necessary security measures. Forensic psychiatrists concluded that these actions reflect the psychosis of a person suffering from mental disorders who has experienced a serious life drama. 7 months after the tragedy, Judge Esther Salas's husband, Marc Angelucci, was still undergoing long-term rehabilitation in a medical facility. His wife, who miraculously survived, although she was the main target of the attacker, launched a campaign to change state laws. Her goal was to prohibit free access to judges' addresses, which seems like a reasonable initiative, given that convicted criminals often seek to take revenge on judges for sentences. In November 2020, she succeeded, and the governor of New Jersey signed a law named after her son. According to the new law, judges' addresses are no longer available to the general public, whereas previously they could be easily found on the internet. Esther Salas is convinced that this measure will provide additional protection to representatives of justice, whose decisions often cause dissatisfaction among defendants, provoking conflicts and attacks similar to the one that took her son's life. Currently, Esther Salas and her husband Marc Angelucci continue to work on promoting this amendment at the federal level, lobbying for its consideration in the U.S. Congress. They perceive this struggle as a desire for justice, because Roy's voluntary departure deprived them of the opportunity to see him punished. They regard such an act as a manifestation of cowardice. Through this activity, the parents hope to perpetuate the memory of their son, who unjustly passed away at the age of 20. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.